You're with dramatic turn. You're with Julian on the Brown Note and a review of Orbital's reissue of the debut album, the Green Album. I've done a couple of at-length Orbital reviews in recent years, as they seem to have been kind of on a comeback of sorts. Their album from last year, Optical Delusion, I thought was actually really good, underappreciated. But they also did their 30-somethings album, where they look back retrospectively over their careers. They are Paul and Phil Hartnoll, and as such I won't go into as much depth about who they are, but they are an electronic music duo and brothers from the southeast of England, who are noted for being the most preeminent in changing the format for electronic dance music away from a DJ playing a 12-inch in a club to the album format, which changed the course of history in electronic music. And I would suggest that their second and third albums are probably the most preeminent in doing so. And also from their 1994 performance on the Pyramid stage at Glastonbury, beamed all over the UK on BBC TV, was the most preeminent in having electronic music acts on the main stage at music festivals. Throughout, they were very closely followed and joined by an amazing raft of UK electronic music acts from that early 90s through to the end of the decade era. The Prodigy, Left Field, Underworld. I mean, it was the Chemical Brothers. It was an embarrassment of riches, and all of those acts did the same thing, which is produce albums first and foremost. Now, the Green Album came out in '91, and it's the weirdest thing about a debut album like this is that it's a transitional one for the band. By the time they come back 2 years later with the Brown Album and then Snivelization, they were the fully formed project. They had two of the greatest electronic music albums of all time. The Green Album is still very much a collection of tracks. The music that they had been making in the run-up to its release, probably from different eras, maybe even from, the Brown Album, they went in, and Snivelization, they went in and recorded an album. But these were probably tracks that were appearing in their live sets, and also they were actually supporting bands like Cabaret Voltaire back then, live. This is a collection more than an album, more than the albums that followed by miles. It's also 5 CDs long, which is hefty. So the first CD is the Green Album itself. The opening track, Mobius is a really good example of the band's sound at that point, and of that sort of 90s, early 90s, older school sound of techno and house music. If you listen back to something like the LFO music from that era, a lot of these sort of initial techno acts in the UK were coming into the UK music charts for some reason. Obviously, Orbital had, with 2 of the biggest singles from the entire electronic music oeuvre of those sort of 89 to 91 era, with Chime and Belfast. And that made their name and made them probably the most prominent exponent. I don't think many people were really listening much to the other major acts around 1990, certainly. But people knew who Orbital were. There's not as much difference between the tracks. I think the Brown Album is very much of one piece. For its better. In the mid-section, which is well over half the album, flows like an EP, every track going into the next track. So it isn't massively diverse like Snivelization is, but here it feels like the tracks are just using the same sonic template because the band's finding their way. it just does, and the music just doesn't have the X factor on a lot of these tracks like Chime and Belfast do, and that's shown by the second track, Speed Freak, which just is close enough to the opening track. They're not anywhere near the band's best music, I don't think. I did like the Mobius. The Macro Head I could have done without. Ular is really good. It's the first one I really thought stood out. It's got a more electrifying sort of dynamic. It's a little bit more loose-limbed on the percussion. You know, the previous few tracks had that sort of wafty snare sound that you'd get in a lot of very late 80s pop music and house music. I've never gated sort of wafty snare sound, and I've never really enjoyed that on anything. It's one of the worst sounds, I think, in popular music. And Ular's got on the verse segments, it's got much sort of more glitchy, modernist sounding percussion, which I really liked, and a bigger hook as well. There's a little bit of an anonymity to the earlier tracks. Desert Storm is indicative of where this album lies in relation to what was coming. An amazing 3-album run. It's a 12-minute long track. One, it involved politics, Desert Storm being the Gulf War at the time. But how this sort of sets its groove and maintains it for 12 minutes. If you move forward to something like Are We Here, another sort of like 14-minute track from Civilization, that's a suite. It moves through so many different tangents and sonic landscapes on its journey, whereas Desert Storm really does sort of fit into a groove and stay there. It's a fine track. I thought the one major reason for this album to exist is the remastering. The sound quality is often excellent, particularly on Fahrenheit 303. I thought it really benefited from having that sound quality, and each sonic element on that track, rather than it all being squashed together, has got its own space in the soundstage, which is really good, and also some funky sort of garagey house piano riffs. Steel Cube Idolatry I thought was pretty bland. High Rise, it's perfectly fine, but it's just a good to mid-tier house track. And given what was coming from the band, the excellence hasn't really appeared so far. The only real standout is Ular, I think. And then we get into the two singles. So they do include them, but they include a live version of Chime, which actually works really, really well. It's a little bit more upright and driving than the iconic, one of the most iconic electronic music singles of all time. It's a little bit more sort of punchier. And you wouldn't know it was a live version, to be honest, if you hadn't read it. In the middle of the two singles, we get Midnight, which has got some really interesting guitars, almost industrial 9 Inch Nails style guitars, which works really well. And then you get the majestic Belfast, which is another iconic single from that early era. It has to be said, though, Belfast and Chime are in a different league of quality to the other tracks on the album. It doesn't work as an album that much. Too many of the tracks cover the same ground. You listen to Civilization in a row, and in the Brown album, and in Insides that followed, and there's a real progression through the music, like the album's telling a story. This is definitely a series of songs that were probably made at different times, maybe released at different times, that sometimes occupy too much of the same soundstage, sonic space, possibly because the duo were finding their feet in using the equipment, which they would do massively in the 2 years from the release of this album. So I would give it an 8 out of 10, because there's a certain element of interest in reliving that sound, which is long since gone. And obviously the likes of Belfast, Chime and Midnight are hardly poor, and Ular is hardly poor, and there's certainly stuff in there. Desert Storm, I thought, was a relatively strong track. It reminded me of the kind of long form tracks from Leftism. It's got that sort of progressive house downbeat sort of vibe to it. So overall, there's nothing bad here. I only really disliked, I think, one track. I'm just holding up to two 10 out of 10 albums that would follow. So I think an 8 out of 10 is fair, given its historical importance and a few great tracks and nothing that's actually poor. And just the intrigue of seeing, this first fermentation of Orbital. The other CDs are a hit and miss affair. It just, overall, it functions as something to put on in the background if you want to hear music from this era that you haven't heard for a very long time, or done in this way, because I think all those UK acts moved on sonically quite rapidly from this sound. So there's a certain nostalgia trip. Like Macro Head from the second CD, I could have the whole of the second CD sounds like tracks that didn't make it to the album, and I feel like that they're mostly weaker ones. Macro Head, I didn't need to hear. Satan, another of the 3 best pre-Brown album singles, one of their finest. It does appear on this collection quite a few times. We get here we get, I think, the single version first, but it does appear a few too many times. Belfast, again, a vocal mix. There's lots of alternate versions, but I don't think any of the alternate versions are really that interesting. They stand out on CD2. The only reason for its existence alongside Satan is the remix by Sasha of Midnight. CD3 has a 13-minute version of Chime and a 15-minute version of Deeper, which immediately makes it a more interesting proposition. The Omen tracks, which haven't appeared, I don't know why they're not all collected together. They're split across a couple of the CDs. I think there's 4 Omen tracks. And they're all pretty decent. I just don't understand why they're split up like this, but they're okay. Choice is another interesting one. It's got another political band, Peace or Annihilation, and Wake Up being yelled as a chorus. It's a lot more sort of thrusting. I don't know what track 9 is called, but I've put down here that it sounds like something from Aphex Twin's analog bubble bath era. Or even Harmonia, I've put down, and Cluster from the mid-70s. Both these CDs are for completists. It is essential to have, Satan involved in your life. That's probably the only you're going to want the Sasha remix because it's Sasha, but those are perhaps the only 2 absolute reasons to keep those 2 CDs. CD4 is a real keeper, though. It's I think 3 different live concerts. Everything on is live. One of them being Synergy, and then a couple of mystery gigs. Really showcases why the band rose to prominence through their live sets. I mean, the Synergy one's from 1990, and they sound fully formed as a live act by them. And the track list is really strong. So it's a lot of the biggest tunes and done really well. That's a keeper. That one totally deserves to exist. And CD5 is lots of remixes. They are, alongside the Aphex Twin, one of the worst bands, electronic music acts to remix. Virtually no remix has ever touched the original. They are too knotty and weird to remix. And some of them are okay, but there's 4 mixes of Chime in a row. Again, there's 2 more Omen tracks. Why not put those all together? Some big names, though. Joey Beltram. He turns up twice for Ula and Chime, which is pretty good. Speed Freak gets remixed by Moby, and that sounds like an old school XR2 sort of driving around Essex after Club UK one. And then Meat Beat Manifesto turn up as well. So there are quite a lot of big name remixes on CD5, but not great results, really. So overall, I guess like the album on its own, I think what would have really worked here is maybe a 3 CD release where you could have kept the live music and then cherry picked the highlights from the other 3 CDs, easily fitting them onto one, and you would have had a stronger. Every single reissue like this, does it have a reason to exist on its own, or is it for the completists? And this is undoubtedly for the completists. There's too much repetition. and too many of the tracks aren't interesting enough to warrant having unless you want every single thing they released during that era. And it doesn't tell a massive story. So, album 8 out of 10, I'm going to give the collection a 6.5 out of 10. 2 great CDs and 3 very middling, fairly uninteresting ones. But great to see them back playing a lot of this music live. I really hope they come over to Australia again. They seem to have their mojo. So great news for Orbital fans. And I really do intend to do reviews of the Brown album and Snivelization at some point.